Bueno, kaixo guzti.
We'll go on with the third session, the third panel of this conference after gathering strength with a coffee break. We're going on with this conference, which I think is very interesting, very suggestive as well, yesterday's session and this morning's session as well. And we are seeing a lot of content to extract insights from and to debate. Yesterday, Isadora presented the general framework of the why, the reason, the motivation for this conference. This morning, Ximena explained more the how of this tool, rapid gender analysis, and now Luisa will tell us about the implementation of the gender perspective in a particular context, which is the one in Colombia, and the response to the Venezuelan crisis. Before we said we have invited different women to moderate the tables, and we have Cristina Churruca Moguruza, who's the director of the NOHA master's degree. She's a professor and researcher at the Institute of Human Rights at the University of Deusto, coordinator of the Erasmus Mundus Joint Master's Degree in International Humanitarian Action, NOHA, and director of the master's degree since 2007. This master is in international humanitarian aid with over 25 years of trajectory, which is given in 8 European countries with associated universities. One of these universities is in Colombia. The main areas of research of Cristina are human security, in particular the protection of displaced persons, and the trends and current challenges in humanitarian action. Over the past 20 years, she has been involved in international research projects and networks of universities, research centers, and social partners and initiatives for the professionalization of the humanitarian sector. We are very grateful to have you here today with us, and we give you the floor for Luisa's talk. Thanks a lot.
Egunon guztioi. Bueno, muchas gracias por tu...
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your presentation. It's my honor to present you Luisa María Vega. She is a feminist lawyer with more than 11 years' experience in the defense, promotion, and incidents in guaranteeing human rights, especially for women, children, and the LGBTI+ population. She has coordinated and implemented development and humanitarian response programs in contexts of crisis caused by armed conflict and more recently by mixed migratory flows in Colombia, ensuring the effective incorporation of the gender approach in the action framework. She is currently program manager of CARE Colombia. CARE, as you know, focuses, particularly in Colombia, on providing humanitarian response to the crisis through the sexual and reproductive health and protection programs with a central emphasis on prevention, risk mitigation, and response to gender-based violence. It has also implemented actions for economic empowerment, strengthening the livelihood, voice and leadership of women. Its core approaches are based on ensuring gender mainstreaming, resilience, and localization. Today she will be talking about, following the previous session and the approach in this conference, the implementation with a gender perspective in action, and particularly considering the case study of the response to the Venezuelan crisis in Colombia and Ecuador. Thanks very much for being with us. You have the floor. Thanks a lot, Cristina. And of course, first of all, I'd like to say thanks to Bilbao City Council and to the Basque Development Agency for having me here in this very important space, which is an opportunity to be able to exchange experiences, the experiences that we have developed, and also we'll be able to learn from the experiences of other countries. and of course through the exchange that we can have with you as participants in this space. As Cristina mentioned before, my role today, and I love this to be so because we have been linking the different conversations of how we start from a wonderful tool for the implementation of the gender perspective in humanitarian responses and how it can interact with other tools that Jimena in her presentation has mentioned, and how it has a direct impact on the implementation of what we do in the response to the Venezuelan crisis in Colombia. So basically, and in order to link the conversation in this panel, we will have 3 segments of conversation. The first one, going back to the humanitarian situation in Colombia in order to know the context and see the context in which we are giving the response, because the Colombian context is quite particular due to the interaction or the overlap of crises, of vulnerabilities existing, and it requires an exercise of adaptation and innovation in this implementation process. A second stage will be, we will be talking about what it means to integrate the gender approach in the processes of action implementation, and in the end, a very small example of how this translates in a particular crisis like the Colombian, like the Venezuelan crisis in the southern Colombian border, and we'll tell you what it's meant to implement those tools in a particular action. So we will start with the situation, humanitarian situation in Colombia. As you know, Colombia is a country of over 50 million inhabitants, where we have lived different stages of what has been over 50 years of armed conflict, with some moments of hope for the country based on the firm of the peace agreement. But as you know, there were very many challenges, and the implementation has not reached even 35%. Only that is implemented. So this is the scenario, and so we have at least 11 million people affected by a humanitarian crisis, 7.7 million people affected directly by this humanitarian crisis, over 2.9 million people with critical needs linked to the impact generated by humanitarian crisis. At the moment, Colombia is a country that is still affected by armed conflict, not international, and according to the International Committee of the Red Cross in 2022, there's at least 6 armed conflicts, non-international conflicts in the country, where we have a diversity of actors, for instance, the National Liberation Army, the self-defenses of Colombia. As you know, some weeks ago, the self-defenses of Colombia were giving problems in 11 different departments in the country. And in order to know the dimension, there's 32 departments in the country. So nearly 50% of the country was blocked by this armed blockout because of this group related to drug trafficking and also related to other military groups. So at the moment, we have identified processes of which are quite serious. Many people who have been victims of displacement only in 2021 were registered 73,000 new people due to this massive displacement in some regions of the country, and over 65,000 people were forced to lock down as a consequence of control by armed forces. This is an emergency that overlaps with the crisis of mixed migratory flows from people coming from Venezuela, because Colombia is one of the countries in Latin America which is receiving migrant Venezuelan population. From 2014 and until August 2021, we had in Colombia about 1.8 million people from Venezuela in our country. they had advanced in their process of regularization of their situation as a consequence of the measures taken by the Colombian government through the Statute of Personal Protection. And so there's been an increase in the evocation of permanence. However, as Mireia mentioned before, we have also answered to a rather particular context of the migrant population who can walk, who is in transit, who goes, walks across Colombia and goes on to other countries like Chile or other countries in the south of the continent, and what it implies for a response in a differentiated context with very particular needs and which requires to be fast, to be quick. And basically, in order to mention some particular needs that allows us to be located in the ensuing conversation, at least 3.9 million women present needs derived directly from VBG, consequences of the armed conflict and the impact of the COVID pandemic in the country. 2.2 million families can eat only twice a day, and at least 5.8 million people who live in territories controlled by some armed group linked to the Colombian conflict. And again, we have been talking about this before. I think it's important to go back to the issue of why gender is so important in the implementation of responses to humanitarian emergencies. And as we've mentioned before, crises have different impact on men, women, boys, girls, population with different gender identities, sexual identities. And gender-based violence are prior to crisis, but they are exacerbated in the context of crisis, and they can even last when we advance in processes of recovery. And here I remember the concept of women who are survivors to violence in a context of armed conflicts. And it is, how do we think of a reparation that can be transformational? This concept of reparation brings us to lead. I want to go back to the previous situation, previous to the victimization, but for women, that's not something valid because they were living under violence before the conflict. So how do we think that reparation has to go beyond the idea of going back to the previous situation? This is something that is directly related to gender-based violence. And there's other elements which are key, and I can use them for the sectorial responses. And it's the WHO, 60% of maternal mortality take place in countries that have been affected by humanitarian crisis. And that's what we mean about the different impacts. And also, as my colleagues mentioned before, humanitarian crisis can also be a window of opportunity in order to start thinking about new gender relationships. In this exercise of implementation that we have carried out, we go through the 4 stages or 4 commitments that will allow us to guarantee the integration of the gender approach in a context of emergency. On the one hand, of course, is rapid gender analysis, where I won't go back to this because we have enough tools now, but we know that it helps us analyze the needs, experiences, and the differential capacities in a context affected by humanitarian crisis. The minimum commitments that are linked to being able to integrate this gender approach in the sectorial response given by organizations that give humanitarian action. How do we think this approach from WASH, from sexual and reproductive health, from protection? A third element, which is about how to think about the role of women in emergency context. And so from this perspective, we can think too of the opportunity scenarios within humanitarian crisis, and so promote the exercises of voice and leadership of women within emergency contexts. And finally, and this is the main idea, what it means, this sectorial response, and how to think a life without violence for those people who are survivors or who are at risk of suffering them in the context of a crisis. This is a little bit the same, but with some additional elements of the experience that we have also implemented in our actions, and which is linked on top of guaranteeing the identification of needs, expectations, particular capabilities, also to ensure a budget which will allow us to give a sectorial response, differentiated sectorial response. But this doesn't involve we have to give a response to everything, because when we have RGA, we identify very many needs, and it's important to see, as Jimena mentioned, which of those recommendations we adopt in the implementation exercises. And for that, we have to have a budget that will allow it. The integration in the sectorial response is very interesting to me, because it involves the work with the team, how we balance the teams in the different territories, how we guarantee that the integration of the gender approach involves questions like parity, equity, representativity of women in decision-making. How do we guarantee permanent training for the teams? And of course, this is just a base to start with some expertises, but it's also important to guarantee the training of these teams and, of course, the work with partners and local organizations. This is a very important point, because this is what will allow us to strengthen and to work with local capabilities, but also promote the experiences women have in those territories, and also from the humanitarian response, a response that can save lives, and how we integrate the possibility of strengthening those organizational processes of women linked to that role of leadership in emergency contexts. And finally, how we guarantee the integration of the gender approach in the processes of assessment, monitoring, learning, and accountability. This is, as Jimena mentioned before, see what we are doing, have a look at what we are doing, find what the impact is, and what we could improve. As our base or starting point is RGA, and here a key element is, we can tell you that Colombia is a young office within the Confederation CARE. It was born in 2009 as a recommendation of an RGA. And it was a recommendation linked to a gap in the integration of the gender approach in the humanitarian response at the country. We had to start thinking how in a context and a response that saves lives, there's limitations in order to satisfy or to meet the needs which are more particular. For instance, what happens with the menstrual hygiene of women in a context of crisis, with prenatal control, what happens with access to abortion in a context of crisis. All those aspects that sometimes we forget. How do we guarantee, and this is also very important, and we saw it with the COVID crisis, how the whole health system gave a response to the crisis, to the COVID crisis, and other services that were linked to sexual and reproductive health was impacted. And then the response, particular response, generated an impact and an additional impact. So RGA has led our exercise of implementation in the territory and has allowed for an interaction in coordination with other organizations in order to capitalize on the existing capabilities on the territory, and we try to generate complementary processes. So here we have some basic headlines of what we can find, or the findings of this RGA. It was a regional RGA in order to understand how the migratory crisis from Venezuela was generating impacts in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Ecuador and Peru, and so we could collect elements in order to design the response in the countries. So one of the main mechanisms was to have access to income for women who are not regular in the countries. We saw there was an increase in violence towards women who were defending their rights. Am I speaking too quickly? And there was a gap in the area of humanitarian actors, and this is very important. How do we guarantee the participation of women and of people affected in the context of crisis in the scenarios of preparation of responses to crisis? But also, I just wanted to say this because this is part of what we were talking about this way, how crisis change gender roles. In particular, the Venezuelan crisis, we saw there that many Venezuelan men were migrating on their own. They left the country, and this meant there was a change in roles. They had women had an additional load because they were assuming the care, but they also had to be suppliers. But this meant decision-making power within the households. They had to make decisions about what was going on in the households, in the homes, and so see those interactions and how are present in the crisis.
How do we guarantee integration? After these steps that I focused on, now we're going to focus on the sectoral responses. If you realize, gender in emergencies is at the center, and I'm specifically talking about our experience as an organization through the experience of the response we have as an organization. And of course, gender in emergencies is the axis of everything we do, and it's the common thread of everything we approach. For, on the one hand, sexual and reproductive health, protection from gender-based violence, economic and personal empowerment, and social integration. Social integration, I won't go into that so much, but anyway, we'll probably see important elements about it. So, this is more about how we do it. What actions specific actions are we carrying out within our sexual response to guarantee that the gender approach is present? And it's basically understanding what are the particular needs we were talking about. So we have 5 areas from the sexual and reproductive rights, so that those impacts can be addressed on the one hand. We have a direct response, that is, we implement actions to guarantee reproductive and sexual rights, and this involves access to contraceptives, access to STD treatment. It involves prenatal monitoring, voluntary pregnancy interruption, and we carry this out through health providers. But additionally, we can't think about what we can't think that we're going to replace the state in a response that should be given by the state. And in that sense, we also work on strengthening, on allocating resources. So how do we work on strengthening local capacities of the public health system to guarantee that the effect when our response complementary action leaves, so they need capacity installed in the territory. And we also talk about the importance of promoting sexual and reproductive rights, and this involves communicating with men, young boys, women, and thinking about, well, and this is a challenge that we always keep in mind, but I think it's great, and it's how do we think about a response that saves lives hand in hand, and the gender approach demands this. How do we guarantee that in parallel we work on the transformation of structures, on the transformation of social norms, on the transformation of skills, of imagination and practices that are fundamental to guarantee an understanding of why it's appropriate to talk about this in a context of humanitarian crisis. And this involves disseminating appropriate information, but also raising awareness, working with institutions, linking community leaders, and also think about the comprehensiveness of the response. That is, how do we guarantee the delivery of kits which complementarily can in a way, broaden the perspective of the response. And here we've had some good practices in delivering kits as assistance, accompanied by provision of services, awareness raising, and its interaction with women. The minimum standards for the integration of gender perspective in our responses, and it's always consults women. What always works is before starting a care process, we carry out focus groups with women who have participated or women who have needs, to see what is appropriate, how we can address it, and what's the best way for the kits to be a complementary response, but also an appropriate response. The second sector for us is protection, and for us protection has focused on exercising prevention and mitigation of risks and response to gender-based violence. How do we do this? Well, prevention is based on awareness raising, dissemination of information, work in the community, communication campaigns. The response to gender-based violence, which is what I want to concentrate on, is based on a model scaling exercise. This morning when I listened to Jimena, I thought how important it is to start thinking about how we scale models. And in order to scale the models, we need to think about how we measure the impact and how we guarantee learning capitalization processes. And the response to gender-based violence is a model being implemented in Ecuador and which scales to Colombia. And right now it's very strong in Central America. And it's how through the management of gender-based violence cases, a management of cases which involves psychosocial accompaniment, legal support, but with an additional thing, which makes the management of cases in a way new, but also enables us to see a bit beyond that. And it's the integration of a form of integration, which is the delivery of cash. We've delivered financial assistance and integrated this in the response to gender-based violence as a way to mitigate the risks of gender-based violence. You know that normally this form of integration involves the delivery of multi-purpose cash, but in this scenario, the delivery of cash is for protection. We don't give it to everyone. There's no conditions on its use, but there is a criteria for its delivery, and it's that cash support is linked to case management. So we start a process of identification, characterization, and support, and we guarantee that cash support is linked to the exercise of case management. I'll skip a bit through this. It's been a good practice, because here integrating these two elements means that we ask ourselves a lot of questions. What happens with the risk? How do you identify that the person requires the cash? Because all people need cash in a humanitarian context to cover a series of needs. And what do they spend it on? What would be the incidence that between that cash that can be spent on strengthening a form of life with the social risk of gender-based violence? We'll see this a bit later on. But this has been part of what is involved in the scaling of the model. The standardized operational processes guaranteeing the identification and characterization of the people who are at risk or who are survivors, and in a way linking it to case management allows us to guarantee monitoring and support. And precisely that is based on being able to measure the impact of the cash on the integration in the gender-based violence. So to give you an example, in the measurements we carry out, because when we hand out cash, what we do later is carry out post-distribution monitoring, and we do this through follow-up with the women who receive the cash. And we see how has the cash impacted the perception of safety in a context of gender-based violence. And we found a lot of answers. We usually find about 70-75% of women who say, I spent the cash on my entrepreneurship project. I spent it on buying food. And when I invested in my entrepreneurial project, I felt I gained financial autonomy. It was easy for me to break the cycle of violence. Very often, as you know, gender-based violence is linked to financial dependence. And in general, regardless of its use, the response by women has been, I feel, a better perception of safety in the context of violences I was in, and I've been able to make decisions. Of course, the process has to be perfected, and that's why we carry out the measurements to see how we guarantee risk mitigation. And here, the core of the issue, how do we carry out case management and hands out with women who are in transit? How do we guarantee case management of gender-based violence with women who are going to see for a maximum of 3 to 5 hours? How do we carry out psychosocial support? Because, as you know, psychosocial support in these cases is essential because the risk of women returning to the aggressors when they're in a cycle of violence is very high. And that has led us to think about different adaptation strategies in the model, because the issue of the transitory population is quite an important one. So we've called this exercise rapid case management, and meeting this has to meet the minimum standards we have within our standardized operational kit, and this is essential. That's why at the beginning I said that if you're coming from an coordination with other organizations present on the territory is fundamental. So what happens with this woman who received support in Cúcuta on the northern frontier and is going to the southern border? Of course, we've designed strategies to guarantee that the care teams are present throughout the humanitarian route and can connect services, but we won't be able to do that in all scenarios. Here, reference exercises with other organizations is essential. How do we guarantee knowledge of what organizations are doing on the ground, and how do we establish reference mechanisms that involve harmless action and no re-victimization? In this case, we've designed, along with other organizations, an interagency sheet. And this interagency sheet allows all organizations to handle the same information. And it's the same information we require to carry out case management. And in that case, we guarantee that the women or people at risk won't have to tell their story again if they were interviewed in Lumfpa or in Arsi. The third sector is associated with personal and financial empowerment. And personal and financial empowerment, this sectoral response has been great for us because it's meant we've learned a lot, and it's how do we start to guarantee within a response that saves lives, interaction, and the next approach. This allows us to think about long-lasting solutions. It allows us to think about more long-term solutions and how the gender approach also interacts in this scenario. So in this response sector, we've been able to work on living forms of life restoration, establishing forms of income. And we have a program called Women Leaders in, and it's how to integrate the gender approach in our response. And integrating women leaders in emergencies, and part of this has been scaling the model. Why? Because women leaders in emergencies is a methodology that's intended to guarantee that women who are affected by humanitarian crises can have or strengthen their voice and leadership, and guarantee the identification of scenarios of participation so that the voice of women can be listened to, acknowledged, particularly in decision-making on how to respond in humanitarian crises. So Here we have an interaction of what would be the phases associated with how do we think about it, how do we analyze it, how do we co-create, how do we act, how do we learn in the interaction between women who have had impacts associated with crises. And to do this, rapid gender analysis has been fundamental, and rapid gender empowerment analysis. And this is an interaction between the RGA with women leaders in emergencies, which allow us to identify the level of leadership of women in contexts of humanitarian crisis. So the RGA for empowerment allows us to identify informal and formal spaces where women are leading. What is the influence on decisions based on the voices of women in humanitarian response plans? What obstacles do they face for participation? What is the opportunity or spaces that present opportunities so that women can participate? And what could be those actions to mitigate the obstacles? So here we have a little example of what the rapid analysis of empowerment showed us, where we started to implement women leaders in emergencies. The communal action meetings are small meetings held in neighborhoods and regions. So what do we find? For example, we find that although we're talking about parity in representation processes, historically women have had a much they had the role of being secretaries, taking down notes at meetings, because there's a perception that the role or task of women is more associated with support activities and not leadership. We also identified that when women take on roles of management and decision-making in organizational contexts, it's still men who actually make the decisions, and maybe it's a bit of a more formal scenario, but not real when taking into account the voice of women. Men promote the work of women within scenarios of representation, but as a way of, so they consider that they have more time, because there's this notion that women, as they don't have a formal job, and we assume that care systems don't contribute to the productive fabric, while we know that they're essential, but we think that women have more time because they're taking on this care role, which involves a lower burden. So there's this mistaken notion of what it means that women can participate in scenarios of leadership. So it's quite particular, and it's that in the context where we apply the rapid gender empowerment analysis, we couldn't see leaderships of the LGBTI plus populations. So based on this exercise, women leaders in emergencies allows us to guide actions to guarantee that women can have scenarios or promote scenarios of participation for women. And when I was saying that we link interaction between the economic and the personal, it's due to a scaling of the model that emerged from the rapid gender analysis, and it's that women say, of course, we need scenarios of participation, but we also need means of living. We need empowerment from the economic perspective to be able to make decisions for our life projects, because if it's going to be it's going to be very hard for us to satisfy our needs when we're migrant women who aren't regularized in a territory. So in this scenario, rapid gender analysis and women leaders in emergencies allows us to interact processes linked to strengthening entrepreneurship, strengthening technical skills for entrepreneurship, for financial education, with a significant exercise of personal empowerment, political empowerment, and which guarantees participation in territories. So this is part of what it has meant to implement the strategy in the territory. For example, 98% of women consider that the process contributed to increased decision-making in leadership spaces. That is, favors the perception of women of acknowledging themselves as leaders in community organization, family environments. And here, this testimony, which I think is beautiful, of a woman who says, now I'm a leader in my neighborhood, and I'm a leader in my home, in all scenarios where the role of women is fundamental, and where they can feel that, based on this exercise of capitalization, they can feel they have a more powerful voice. 46% of the participants mentioned that they felt more acknowledged as leaders within their communities. So if I think I'm a leader, because now I can help my association, my community, and sometimes there's this perception that it's only men who do that, but no. So there's an acknowledgement of women's work in leadership processes. And this sector in particular has allowed us to integrate the response from protection and reproductive and sexual rights through long-lasting responses, because groups of women within the women leaders in emergencies build their response actions within the prevention of gender-based violence, guaranteeing access to sexual and reproductive health, and in that sense, they take on a significant role of leadership within the sectoral response to the humanitarian crisis.
En los procesos de
In the monitoring processes, the accountability also plays a role in the gender roles. We have some principles linked to the conversation this morning. How do we guarantee that the monitoring assessment processes, accountability processes, and learning processes, we understand that it's the community, the owner of that knowledge and of that information that we collect through these processes? How do we guarantee that we have this understanding in these processes of transformation, positive or not? This is important to bear in mind. What happens when I go to a community and I talk about gender equality in a context of humanitarian crisis? I can have an understanding which is positive or not, and see how we can provide a response in that scenario where the contribution is not necessarily well received by everyone in that community. To give priority to the implementation of methods that transfer, well, here we mentioned power, but I think it is more an exercise of work in relation with the communities. So understanding how the changes come by and how we, along with the community, we have to think about the factors that generate change, and also guarantee that the monitoring, assessment, and learning processes have the resources, the budget, because we think of scaling up models, guaranteeing the integration of models, and it requires to analyze how we are doing there, what things we are doing right or not, and how we can measure the impact. And in this scenario of sectorial response, integrating gender approach, to us it's been very important to have data, to collect data. How do we do it? Through, on the one side, the same sectorial response we do. First, we obtain data from the services we provide. I mentioned some time ago, we have monitoring post-distribution, some satisfaction surveys. What's the additional element here? We are talking about cash, but it's a PDM of cash to mitigate risk of violence, gender-based violence. I have to include questions associated to how the cash implies an impact in the risk mitigation of violence related to gender. Maybe it wouldn't be used in some other more traditional approach, and we would be maybe more interested in asking, where did you spend the cash? Did it meet your needs? Here, there's an intention in identifying how the cash can mitigate risk of gender-based violence through stories of women who have run away, satisfaction surveys, and this is the example of the data that we can collect. Types of violence, assaultants, the risks that women suffer, or people who are in a context of gender-based violence. And here we have an important question, and it is, what do we do with the data we have? is it necessary for me to ask this? Am I going to do this with this information? Because if I'm asking something which I don't need or that I'm not using, it may be an action with damage. Why am I asking a woman who feels something about the violence if I'm not going to do nothing with that information? I'm generating an expectation, but I'm not capitalizing on the information I may obtain. And so what do we do with this data? We do information production, visibilization of the changes in the situation dynamics, and this is helpful for people who have to do the decision making and maybe see how we can impact the transformation of policies through the production of information. And I think I've run out of time. I just want to show you very quickly the case study, a case study of action where we could integrate all the tools that we have mentioned, and it is the response to the Venezuelan crisis in the southern border of Colombia, next to Ecuador as well. And here we are based on the development of a rapid gender analysis, which we carried out on both sides of the border. There we could find out things as impressive and as key for the exercise of programming the response, like, for example, the risk of exposure that were greatest for women, for girls, for LGBTI population in gender-based violence, in the family context, in the access to economic activities, and how this generated an interaction with discrimination processes, and how the health crisis that was overlapping with the migratory crisis made 100% of Venezuelan families lost or decreased their incomes, and this had a great impact on women, the young, and the LGBTI population. And based on all this, we developed our sectorial response, which talk about prevention, risk mitigation, case management, access to sexual and reproductive health. We developed a model of integral transborder management, which generated some very important things of exchange, and it's also to do with guaranteeing the safety of people who are going from country to country, and how we guarantee the connection between teams, and we have to provide a binational answer. And here, the key element, beautiful, central element of this case is how women have been leaders of this emergency in this process. We scaled women leaders in emergency that had started in the north and took them to the south of the country. And now this is a trans-border process that links Colombian, Ecuadorian, and migrant Venezuelan women. This is a wonderful exercise, and they could build together the transborder agenda for women. And this agenda is telling the institutions, the organizations, this is what is going on with us, and this is what we need. And here it's very important to integrate the RG8 with the agenda. So this is why this morning when we were speaking about the role of women, of women's organization, it's very important, because this is a tool that generates evidence and allows us to help in creating the agendas of women. So I will finish by a symbolic act that had an impact not only on the women who created it, but it also had an impact on the public opinion, institutions. On December the 9th last year, women leaders in emergency took the Rumitaka Bridge, which is the international bridge that joins Colombia and Ecuador when the border had been shut. So we did something, and so migration from both countries opened up the bridge, and this is the image. And women from both countries got together. They got together on the bridge, and the idea was women could do what governments couldn't, because for a very long time, both governments had been talking about you open the border, I do, I don't, and then women, for one day, they could guarantee a connection in a context of crisis, of pandemic, of armed conflict. So this was something symbolic in order to show their transborder agenda. Have I spoken too much? Only 3 minutes. I've been trying to control the time, and someone told me maximum 53 minutes. So now we have time for...
Canso el tiempo para el video.
Luisa María, thanks for sharing this incredible experience of yours, which is so interesting. Interesting sounds like something very little. It's been really very interesting, and I have learned a lot. I'd like also to thank the Basque Agency for cooperation. I didn't do it at the beginning. I'm very grateful that you have invited me to this conference because I'm learning a lot about what you're doing on ground. This experience of scaling up the model, this rapid gender analysis and power has been very interesting. And I guess we will have some questions about it.
Aquí tenemos una.
Hola, buenos días.
Hi, good morning. I'm Monica from the Assembly of Cooperation for Peace. I wanted to ask you, because you said you were established in Colombia as CARE in 2019, and all over the process, what's the role of feminist organizations and of women's organizations in the territory in the identification and collection of data? Because there's a feminist movement which has been there for a long time in Colombia. So how is the relationship and those possible partnerships? Any other questions?
During your presentation, you talked about the cash assistance activity. What measure you use to, or in general, we use to minimize or to apply the strategy of do no harm for women under violence? Thank you.
Sí.
Buenas.
Hello. I'd like to transmit several questions that we have received online, and we'd like to say thanks to all those who are participating online. One of them was the Yanira Rodriguez. Maybe she will answer the two previous questions. Okay, I'll wait. Right. About the role of feminist organizations, of course, you are right. Colombia has a very strong feminist social movement, which has been organized, and it has a very clear agenda. We are in the process of trying to scale up the data collection, the information collection, for instance, the tool of rapid gender analysis that has been vital in interaction with organizations, how to link that and improve in the linking of women's organizations who may have a longer trajectory, because if you think of it, the implementation we've done so far has been with women belonging to smaller organizations, local organizations, women who are sometimes even not in organizations, in order to promote the exercises. And we are in this process of scaling up and link it to broader structures with platforms, organized platforms of women, and how rapid gender analysis can also become an exercise or a tool for the evidence to boost the exercise of positioning these agendas. And at the moment, we are considering about enlarging our work perspective, linking different elements, and there's several aspects when we can interact along with the organizations with other platforms of rural women, for instance, when we speak about food security, economic justice, and other issues. Of course, this is part of our mapping exercises, of our dialogue in order to scale up the tool and work much more with formal organized structures of women. And the second question linked to the mitigation measures, this is very important. And it has led us to think how the management model of cases of gender-based violence is a model with an approach based on survivors. This implies there must be flexibility and the adaptation of the tools, of mechanisms, and in the proceedings just to mitigate those risks, which involves that if I give cash to the woman in this place or in this way, it involves my doing the support in the community, or maybe the woman can go to the place where I am. So the measures we have implemented are very much associated to building an action plan to link it with the particular needs of each woman. We have an operational process which is standard, with the minimum standards to guarantee the management of cases. The approach focused leads us to think this is a protocol that has to be more flexible, and it has to give a response to the particular needs of women. So we have come up different things, women who tell us, no, I'll be using the cash to leave my family, to leave my home, and I'm going to meet my son, who is maybe in Pasto, in the southern frontier, and she's in the northern border. So how do we generate this support, this exit, safe exit from home, in order to give the cash? And so this giving her the cash doesn't generate that risky situation for the woman. So I think being able to adapt the protocols and the case plans to the real needs and particular needs of women is what has allowed us to guarantee this risk mitigation. And in this scenario, it's essential to have support and to have a follow-up of the cases. I gave the cash, and what happened? How's the woman at the moment? This has generated a new situation of violence, risk of violence. So how do we generate something else that will help us not turn this into a new scenario of violence for the woman? So this is something what the tools should be doing. The questions from the online questions? One of them from Deyanira Rodriguez from International Solidarity. She was asking whether this rapid gender analysis linked to the economic empowerment can be applied in any emergency situation. She gave us an example in cases of natural disasters or armed conflict, and how to adapt them. Okay, can we have several questions maybe? And another two questions from the previous session, but since we are speaking about rapid gender analysis, if we can give an answer to this. Well, one of them asked about the link. It was made by Agustin Gabati from Rwanda, and he speaks how can we link the rapid gender analysis with the policy of gender of local entities. Are there any clues you can give us or any key elements? And another one, Jean Rax from the Democratic Republic of Congo, he spoke about the situation where women are considered as objects, and whether you take into consideration the awareness, the sensitiveness to other kinds of masculinity in this diagnosis of gender diagnosis, or do you do it later? Well, about the first question about rapid gender analysis and power, the answer is yes. As Isadora explained and Jimena mentioned as well, this tool is designed to be able to give a response in crisis contexts. And specifically, this analysis is trying to analyze the impact of the role of women in context of crisis. If it's a context for a natural disaster, we have to think what are the scenarios of decision-making in order to prepare the response where women can participate, can have an impact, where they can take on a leadership role. The importance of being able to identify those findings along with identifying these spaces and the limits in order to have an impact on those spaces. So this rapid gender analysis is very good to give a response in any crisis scenario, and also taking into account the characteristics of its situation. But this one involves being able to analyze or going beyond or having a look at the structures in order to make decisions. And of course, it's very appropriate because I think here the important part is to think, why are we doing this rapid gender analysis and power analysis? Why do we want to do it? We have this tool which allows us to identify the impacts and then have some recommendations. Why do we want to have this analysis of gender and power? What are the scenarios where we can identify the possibilities for the participation of women? So I think the answer is a little bit the other way around. We have to think about the intentionality of this analysis and guaranteeing that it may have an impact on the fact that organized or non-organized structures can have a greater incidence in decision-making. As to the link of rapid gender analysis with local entities, we have seen it a lot on the territories. There are some recommendations addressed to public institutions and to local entities. And this is part of what involves the building of a dissemination plan. How do we link public institutions and local entities in the dissemination of the findings and recommendations, and how this can have an impact in the role that public institutions have to in things such as the routes of protection for the protection of gender-based violence, which might be an area within a city council, and they can have something specific to protect those women. Of course, it is very much linked, but we have to see how we guarantee that the dissemination plans can have an impact and can reach the public institutions, because they have the responsibility in guaranteeing the response in crisis contexts. And the involvement of men and boys, this is one of the strong points that we are in the process of strengthening. The look of positive masculinities, of changing masculinities with a very important role in the exercises of prevention of gender-based violence, but also in the transformation of social norms, in the transformation of structures. And this has been part of the sectorial response. How do we link women to those processes of strengthening capabilities, not from the role of attacker, but rather from a positive role they can take on in the transformation of those structures and in the building of new masculinities changing.
¿Hay otra pregunta?
There's another question.
Sí, te escuchamos.
Ahora.
At the beginning of your presentation, you drew a general map of the multiple crises that Colombia is going through, and you also talked about the implementation of the peace agreement between the government and the FARC, which is the first in history that has a gender approach thanks to the struggle by women in Colombia, that whole fabric, that feminist movement that has fought for it and demanded it, and they've achieved it and made history. What enables this commitment signed by the government? So how can we fit that work within that framework when demanding from the government? It's the government that signed that peace agreement, which includes gender agreements in each one of the points. Or is there a bridge between those analyses, those recommendations, and those commitments that the Colombian government has acquired? Are there any others? Shall we listen to some more questions? there's something that strikes me, and it's how you work through values, myths, beliefs held by people to then generate this transformation, because we all acknowledge that gender issues have a cultural substrate of values and beliefs. And in many of the contexts we're talking about today, we've seen Somalia, Ethiopia, Colombia, and so on, the substrate of religious beliefs and values is very strong, with an associated religious structure that's very patriarchal and masculine. And at the same time, with humanitarian actions that are very strong, promoted by these same religious organizations. So when you talk about working with leaders, religious leaders, people who are setting sometimes positive actions, because there's this duality in many cases. So how do you work with this, the role of religious organizations is very acknowledged and very worked in, but regarding gender, there are things that lead to a lot of controversy, and sometimes within the religious organizations themselves. We've seen this in Peru and Colombia and Guatemala, Orthodox churches in Ethiopia, Muslim communities in Somalia, and so on. So is this included or not? Because that substrate, not only the leaders who are part of that cultural substrate, but there also permeates lots of layers too. By the way, in the last image, there are some crosses. I don't know if it's by chance or if it was related. Okay. As for the peace agreement, I entirely agree. I think the inclusion of the gender approach within the peace agreement was a victory by feminist movements and women's movements in the country. Yesterday, we said that the gender approach, because it's deep-rooted in Colombia, because these patriarchal structures are deep-rooted in Colombia, perhaps the instrumentalization of the discourse was essential to create a sensation of resistance in communities to approve the agreement. So the approach, the fact that it's there, it's a symbolic victory, it's a political victory, it's a victory by the agendas of women's associations. And you said something that's very true, and it's how to guarantee that the agreement as a state policy, not a government policy, is a reality in the territory. And that's been the big debate with the current government, which has implemented different measures or not implemented some of them to, in a way, transform, to disassemble some of the things that were agreed upon, or simply not act in their implementation. Here there's something big that we're starting to think about in the scaling up of the work in the territory, and it's how, through the logic of the triple nexus, we start to guarantee that the construction of peace is present in the link to the humanitarian response and with development too. And that means thinking about, for example, now that we're going to start an intervention in the area of the southern border of the country in the mountain range that will integrate humanitarian response due to migration crisis and response to the armed conflict, how do we guarantee that that interaction can be reflected in an exercise to generate evidence, in an exercise of scaling up and capitalization of models as we carry out an gender-based violence in the context of migration crisis and the context of armed conflict? And also, how do we I can start to imagine how the role of women who lead in contexts of emergencies also connect with the peace and security agenda. What's the role of women, for example, Venezuelan migrants who are already settled in the country, for example, Colombian women who have survived gender-based violence in a scenario of construction of peace, which also includes thinking about that the peace agreement is not only disarmament, but it also includes thinking about the transformation of the patriarchal structure in relations and the response. And as for religious associations, well, we've had some experiences. We've had positive experiences. We've had positive experiences in direct work with, for example, shelter spaces that are managed by religious associations where we're going to provide services. So, regarding gender-based violence, maybe there's no discussion as to the impact, but yes, as regards sexual and reproductive health, as you know, we say, how are we going to offer voluntary pregnancy interruption in a scenario of in a safe space that's managed, for example, by a religious organization? We've had a number of interactions. We haven't had tensions or limitations because our position is we don't relativize human rights. We can't relativize the human rights of women as a result of a position held by an actor for example, in a religious organization. Abortion is a right, and it's a right in a context of crisis and of war, and in that sense, we authorize services based on the guarantee of human rights, and we don't relativize things. And we've also carried out awareness raising and dialogue, and in that scenario, we've worked with evidence, data that we collect, and that also leads to what do we do with the data. So, for example, showing the impact of women not having access to contraceptives, women not having access to voluntary pregnancy interruption. And we've been able to create partnerships where they've maybe made their views more flexible, and we've been able to provide services associated to sexual and reproductive rights. And of course, it's not this task hasn't been finished. It's ongoing in process of interaction dialogue, but always based on the fact that we don't relativize the human rights of women, but quite the opposite. We make them present to guarantee them in contexts of humanitarian crises. Then we have other experiences that are closer to social pastors or caritors who have a different vision, so to speak, of support and responses in crisis. But in more local areas, the neighborhood priest who opens his doors and receives migrants, there we've been able to carry out processes, and they've been very good experiences, and we've had good practices that have worked. Yes, from streaming again. I'll repeat it again. I know you've answered what you could, but there's awareness about the interest in the religious beliefs of the societies we work with and how we work on that, which could happen in different contexts. This is asked by Youssouf Afafa from Senegal. Maybe in the next panel this can be addressed by some of the participants, because there is some concern about how to work with the religious beliefs of societies themselves. On the other hand, Gurute Aithpura from Mundo Baken says she liked your presentation a lot, and she had two questions related to intervention. She asked, the delivery of cash to women who are victims of gender-based violence, could it be carried out when the victims are in transit and don't want to stay in the country? And on the other hand, she was asking about LGBTI people, if they are seen as recipients of programs, recipients of cash support to prevent the risk of gender-based violence. Well, I'll answer the three of them briefly. As for beliefs, do I have time? Okay. As for the religious beliefs of the people we work with, it's a very important element, and I'm going to focus on pregnancy interruption. And that's because it's one of the services that can cause the most anguish to women, because there's a stigma, there's fear of punishment, but a fear of social punishment, a punishment due to their beliefs and their faith. And in that scenario, what's worked very well is clarifying values. from the perspective, from the human rights approach, to give them peace of mind to take informed decisions. I think in that scenario, what's most important is to guarantee the right of women to decide, but based on scientific information, but also information that has empathy towards their feelings, their emotions, their fears, their questions. So through integration with support in a case-by-case basis, which is very impersonal, and then awareness-raising campaigns, which are more broader, they're based on being able to collect those questions and be able to guarantee that people can make decisions that are informed and that go hand in hand with the opportunity to access the service. So that's always very present in adaptation strategies, in the construction of methodologies. It has to be a context-based response. It has to be a response that has an eye on the culture, and that also includes recognizing the personal practices and personal beliefs of the people we work with. As for cash for people in transit, yes, that's a very good question. Thanks for asking it, because maybe I didn't talk about that too much, because that's a challenge. So how do we monitor, how do you do follow-up after we hand out cash if we probably won't see those people again? So what has worked in this case is to connect services, and connecting services with other teams of ours in the territory or other organizations. So we always keep in mind the mapping of actors in the areas and coordination with other organizations. So if I hand out the cash, because there are probably people who need the cash to guarantee safe arrival, even though we also have humanitarian transport, and that's something I didn't mention. So being able to guarantee that the person who's in transit can mitigate risks along the way. There are huge exposure risks to people trafficking, sexual exploitation, forced recruitment, and so on. So we offer this through safe transport so that that cash can be used for other uses that may also have other risks, gender-based violence risks. But how have we done that with our teams? So if we know that the person who's going to Paso, which is on the southern border, or to in another area we have intervention, we always connect with the teams to guarantee follow-up. If it isn't with us, it's with another organization who is present in the region, but we never leave a person who has started a case management process and has received cash without follow-up or without monitoring. And I forgot. Yes, of course. That's it. That's why we talk about survivors or at risk of gender-based violence. This broadens the logic of who the protection services are aimed at and the delivery of cash. And we've had experiences of support for gender-based violence cases and a variety of organizations who have the particular feature where in these scenarios there's an interaction of the context of violence with scenarios of discrimination and xenophobia. And that enhances the risks of protection. And our response is always aimed at addressing the needs and being able to link the process, of course, and to different LGBTI people as well. Thank you. Are there any further questions? Streaming has lots of them. I think this is a question from Senegal, and he asks, after analyzing the data, how is that returned to the population, and how do you work with the population itself who live and experience those situations of conflict and crisis? And Jean-Jacques from the Republic of the Congo, he says we're talking about rights, human reproductive rights, but they're not taken into account in humanitarian action in the case of refugee camps or displaced people. So what he says is, how can the tool integrate this issue? Or does it integrate it so there is an awareness of this? The first question is more associated with accountability regarding the data we collect in the RGA. This is one of the things we have to perfect in the exercise, and it's how we return the information to the community, because that includes creating processes to take ownership of the tool and its results. However, we have a great experience, which is what I told you about in Ecuador, and it's how the findings and recommendations from the RGA in an exercise of returning it to women on both sides of the border also led to an exercise of co-creation of a cross-border agenda, which I think can help in step 6 of the RGA to see how we can do a follow-up of the recommendations, because there's an interaction between these two products, and it's women created monitoring committees in order to guarantee that what they were demanding in their cross-border agenda, which has a source of evidence in the RGA, that it's fulfilled. So it's a first experience that we have of how we return information so it's useful for organizations of processes of women leaders in emergencies, so that we can start to scale it up as a way to promote the use of the tool, but also for accountability in information, in the information that we collect. Well, sexual and reproductive rights. Okay. Obviously, I talk from my partiality of what it means, because it's involved in what we do. So all our exercises have been focused on highlighting the importance of sexual and reproductive rights and make them always present in humanitarian action. And this isn't, I mean, there's evidence in regional and local RGAs where, in context of crisis, sexual and reproductive rights do not necessarily correspond to a response that saves lives immediately, and in that sense, it's not necessarily part of the immediate programming that organizations have, those who provide humanitarian responses. So the work we've done through the collection of data, through the barriers to access experienced by women when they want to access contraceptives or prenatal control services, particularly during the pandemic, has been fundamental to strengthen the routes for referrals and to strengthen the capacities of the public health system, but also hand in hand with other organizations. We've also been able to position in health clusters, in intersectoral tables, that sexual and reproductive rights in scenarios of normality, these are rights that have a lot of barriers for there to be exercised. When a woman wants to prevent a pregnancy, there are lots of barriers. If you're 30 years old, then you might regret it. When there's a crisis or not a crisis, and they ask for a contraceptive, they're not asked which one do you want. They say this is the one you need. So how then, in a scenario of crisis, can this be encouraged? Why? It's not a priority. Why? Because there are additional barriers, and the woman isn't regularized. So we find a number of elements that start to be linked one to another, and talking from the partiality of the response, because obviously it's part of our agenda. It's always present with the intention of making information visible, and the barriers and data and the coordination we carry out with other organizations.
Gracias. Yo quería aprovechar que además un poco como
And well, to close, I'd like to mention, beyond sexual and reproductive rights, I think what you pointed out is very important on the role of leadership of women. and how crises are scenarios of opportunity for transformation, to give women more participation, and not only, as you say, for them to be the chairwoman of the local committee, but a fact of making decisions. And in that sense, how can we work on this idea of this new way of working, which is the nexus, towards more sustainable solutions, more transformative solutions? For you, what are the keys? And what reluctances are there by other actors, donors for that, or are you not finding this? Well, I think localization here is fundamental. To think about scenarios of sustainability of the work we do, the localization approach is key because we're working with local capacities. And we can't think that the organization arrives. There's a wealth of work by communities, by women's organizations in regions. How we should think about working with the population on strategies that promote the voice and leadership of women. But through this exercise, we have to think about processes to strengthen actions for the transformation of structures. So how do we continue advancing in this, which could be the strengthening of the agency goes hand in hand with strengthening actions for the transformation of structures, and how this doesn't necessarily have to be linked to a response that saves lives. I think that's the central point. How can we guarantee access to immediate services, but as this can also go hand in hand with processes to strengthen skills for joint work. But in addition to that, it also includes how can we work with organizations which also implement response actions that are local, and in this exercise there's a win-win in the action. So we can't think that we arrive, here's the funding, and then things have to be done, 1, 2, 3 like this. No, but how? We have great working experiences with local organizations where the strong part has been financial education. As we've arrived with the gender-based approach and emergency leaders, we've been able to connect and establish a really great strategy for financial and personal empowerment. So I think the vision there is to see how we can guarantee interaction between this immediate response with, particularly for the gender approach, with the transformation of social norms and structures. And from the perspective of funding, I think it's an approach that's always been very present. There's a challenge because to think about the transformation of structures and social norms mean impact measurements. And very often, from the perspective of funding, there's the scope. So how many people can we reach out? We reach 30,000, 50,000. Well, if I'm thinking about transformation of social structures and social norms, I won't reach out to 50,000, I'll reach out to 50. So how can we think about an exercise to balance and guarantee that these two elements are going hand in hand and are not necessarily exclude each other's action?
Muchas gracias. Yo creo que
Well, I think I'm not gonna try and make a summary. I think with this end, it's been a great end to the presentation. The importance of leadership and of the work of the networks are two of the fundamental questions that we could emphasize or highlight. Thanks a lot. Thank you. And now we will move on to the next panel.
Bueno, iruditzen bazaizue jarraitzen dugu.
We'll go on with the next panel. We would like to remind you that we will have in the neighboring room, there's a mural where you can write down some ideas or highlight some ideas, and let's move on from that rapid gender analysis, from that work of Care International that we have dealt with, and we will now keep on working in other spaces. At the moment, we want to know about another experience, along with Luisa Dietrich. For that, we have Laura Mula with us. We have contacted her. She's to our left, where she is in charge of the organization, execution, and development of training activities, both online and face-to-face, as well as the planning and execution of events related to humanitarian action, building of peace, and disaster risk reduction, among others. She also coordinates the management of the website, social networks, and communications of the MTT. There's very few. The Institute of Studies about Conflicts and Humanitarian Actions, IECA, starts in the year 2000, coinciding with the emergence of the new millennium, with the aim of bringing a new perspective to debates related to the humanitarian world and peace building in a changing context influenced by globalization and its many phases. Its work focuses on 3 areas of expertise: humanitarian action, disaster risk reduction, and peace building. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I was going to say good morning, but it's good afternoon by now. First of all, I'd like to thank the audience, those present here, both here face-to-face and online, and also the Basque Cooperation Agency and the Bilbao City Council for working for this event. As we have seen in this conference, we have seen that it's necessary to have participation of women in humanitarian action, and also the localization is very important as well, and also the capabilities and experiences of these people in particular contexts, as we've seen in the case presented by Luisa María in Colombia, with the presentations by Ximena and Isadora with rapid gender analysis. Today we have here with us another Luisa María. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Luisa María Dietrich Ortega. She's a researcher and consultant in humanitarian, fragile, and conflict-afflicted settings. She has worked as gender specialist in Oxfam's global humanitarian team in emergencies in Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Yemen, and she's currently the director of Gender Consulting, who's an independent consultancy who works in gender justice, conflict and fragility, and humanitarian response. Today, Luisa will be telling us about the experience of women affected by humanitarian crisis through 4 different perspectives: Bangladesh, Colombia, Jordan, and Uganda. Luisa, I have to ask you, who's holding the mic today? Okay, can I go there? Her presentation will be in English, so if you need the earphones.
Hola, hola. ¿Quién tiene el micrófono?
Who's holding the mic? That's the title of the presentation. I'll be speaking in English.
So today, I'm going to share the experience of using participatory video with crisis-affected women to learn about gender transformative change, to learn about participation, and to learn about localization. So the title goes, Who Holds the Microphone? This is a research that was commissioned by UN Women, funded by SIDA, Swedish SIDA, and USAID. This is not my effort. We were a team of 4 women, a multidisciplinary team with 2 videographers, and 2 gender advisors. We were kind of rotating. Before starting, it works. I would like to share with you some reflections on the title. So, who holds the microphone is a metaphor. In the smaller sense, it is a sentence that we often heard as women were setting up their videos, kind of sharing experience, trying to involve everyone, dividing work, ensuring that everyone gets heard. So if we go back to this one, we go back to the fluffy big one, right? So it was very interesting to see the discussions around who holds the microphone. But also in a bigger sense of saying it is fundamentally about power in humanitarian decision-making. It is about who speaks and who does not, who is not visible, right? In which format are we expected to speak? You come to my big conference and you speak with the microphone and you speak in English. Might be challenging, right? So in which format are we expected to speak? On what topic are we expected to speak? Or you are here to speak about WASH. No, but I want to talk about education and my children. No, this is a space to talk about WASH. So it's also very much about the topic. And finally, about whose priorities, who sets the priorities, right? So we felt that the question, who holds the microphone, is deeply disruptive of existing power structures in the humanitarian systems. It challenges on how we see the people, the women we work with in the communities, right? This idea of powerless victims acted upon beneficiaries versus active agents, right? With voice, with power, also as decision makers. With regards to the outline of the presentation today, I want to briefly talk about the background of the research. I would like to speak about the report, which is publicly available. I want to speak around 3 different sets of findings around gender transformative change, and so many beautiful connections with the other Luisa María from the other panel, but also participation and localization. I want to share some participatory videos with you from Bangladesh and Colombia, but also from Syrian refugees in Jordan, hopefully, and also from South Sudanese refugees in Uganda. And I want to share with you a selection of quotes. I'm going to jump around, so please bear with me. Then I will have I've been asked to speak about challenges and critical reflections, also happy to discuss in the question and answer section, and then, of course, some closing remarks. Yeah. So the research assignment. This was a super broad, super flexible research assignment. It was this understanding that there is a gap between crisis-affected women and those decision makers at international level, often white, often male, but there is not a direct connection, right? The framework, because this is a bit too loose perhaps, the money was granted to influence the grant bargain signatories, particularly those ones working on participation and localization work streams. So the grant bargain, what is it? This is an agreement between the world's largest donors and aid providers to improve the effectiveness of humanitarian action. However, this beautiful agreement is gender blind, right? So Action Aid and CARE have published a super interesting report in 2018 of saying, yeah, the organization pledged their commitments. However, the commitments are still failing to reach grassroots women's rights organizations. They are not felt by women affected by crisis. So we have this amazing effort to change the humanitarian system, but once again, it's gender blind. I'm going to jump a bit. So with regards to the study locations, we have already explained the criteria given also to us by the money grantors was to work in 4 large-scale, protracted refugee and displacement crises, both in camp and non-camp settings, and also in urban settings, in Quibdó, Colombia, for example. So these are the 4 locations. And with regards to the methodology, so it was a traditional mixed methods approach. But here I've been asked to speak a bit more about this participatory video component. So what we did with our visual anthropologists in the team was to develop and adapt participatory video for the purpose of complementary data collection. Normally you use that to kind of work in community engagement, but it was like, let's try and use it as complementary data collection. 2 separate participatory videos were filmed in each location, so in total we have 8. They're all in the beautiful report, and you can click on them via link. We have been very clear from the outset that these videos are not mine, not from the donors. These videos are a creative product of 8 to 15 crisis-affected women. In Colombia, we had 2 men being part of the Women's Network, and working together over a course of between 3, 4, and 6 days, I would say. So the process, everyone keeps asking about the process. So we came up with facilitated discussion sessions around the grand bargain, what is it, humanitarian agencies, changes, how were the gender relations before, how are they now, what has changed since you arrived, opportunities, possibilities, but also challenges. We would work around validating the specific research question in each context, trying to together organize ideas, work in breakout sessions, and also discussions in plenary. We interlinked this quite interestingly with an audiovisual training, which we called Making My Voice Heard. So it was about basic skills for women filming themselves and filming one another. And then we engaged in participatory, sometimes it had to be collaborative editing. So women mostly kind of deciding which pictures would go when, how they wanted to present and introduce themselves, and also signing this off. Perhaps also responding to the questions from our international online participants, The devolution of the results is so important. So we had, after each process, joint screening sessions with participants and also with the families, which was a beautiful, like they were almost film stars, on a big wide screen, inviting the community, but also the families over. But also discussion sessions after. Certificates were handed out for all participants who completed the training. Of course, with copies of the film, so they could also screen and use that. So I hope that's not too much info, but I'm happy to discuss kind of further. But quite interesting and also new to the women we work with. Oh, we've never done this before. Interesting. Okay, cool. These are our videos, so quite some ownership here. I want to leave you just a minute with those kind of images. So these are images from 4 different contexts where women work together and collaboratively on their videos. Shall I comment on them? So perhaps on the top left-hand corner, we have Colombian women, Afro-Colombian women, indigenous women working together on their participatory video. On the right top, we have Ugandan host community exploring the camera together in this videography sessions. Top to the left, we have Rohingya participants from an organization called Peace Women, or Shanti Mohila, in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. And last but not least, of course, the Syrian refugees filming their participatory video in Satari camp. Very kind of traditional way of presenting this. In total, we spoke to more than 400 study participants. The outputs were, as I said, the 8 short video films, but then also we had 9 video clips. Video clips were intended as a more an interview kind of session to shine a light on particular affectations. So we have a trans LGBTQ activist in Kibdo, for example. We do have 2 imams in Bangladesh, perhaps also the religion question, working against early child marriage, quite interestingly. and also kind of indigenous representatives who also not only participating in this collective video, but also having their own kind of video clips. This is a bit what you will find in the report. Just type into your search browser who holds the microphone. You will get direct access to it. In there you will find practical stories of gender transformative change. You will find direct women's voices. You will find participatory videos and clips linked through QR codes. So I imagine you all sitting in front of your computer with your cell phone. This will take you to a YouTube site where all the videos are stored. You will have context-specific analysis, conceptual chapters, but also practical entry points. Yeah. So I would like to start off and pick off where the last table left off, and really around confirming that gender transformative change emerges, is possible in each and every humanitarian context. Openings, entry points, they arise, they are context specific. The challenge is to properly identify them, to identify what is relevant to women, why is it relevant to women, and how can it be done in a smart way to actually amplify impact. And this is where I think the CARE RGA really comes in, because it asks also these questions. So it's really about identifying the opportunities. In practice, what does this mean? It can mean a series of trainings, empowerment leadership trainings, of course, the traditional way of doing things. But opportunities also arise from the context where they are now arriving. Less movement restriction, for example. New or unprecedented access to income generation. Peer support through women's organizing. Those are all opportunities and entry points to start a gender transformative process. And here again, the reference to the RGA. So it's about understanding who the people are we work with, the differences, the particularities, but also understand the situations they came from, lived experience, and contrasting that with the current context. I told you I would kind of jump around. I want to share with you the first quote up front. I'm going to read that. In South Sudan, when we went to meetings, women were not allowed to talk. But now in Uganda, we can talk. We have the right to talk. We can ask anything in the meetings. Before, when you wanted to talk in a meeting, in brackets, the man would say, no, you are a woman, you cannot talk. This just as an example how the context, the situation changes, with Uganda being one of the most kind of open countries to welcome a large amount of refugees from all neighboring countries, but also having participatory community structures in place and also representation mechanisms on 3 different levels. So actually standing for elections becomes a possibility, right? Great, and now please bear with me. I would like to share the first video clip with you, and I'm not so familiar. Okay, let's pray. So this is the religious question. So I would like to share with you one video clip, which is about 5 minutes long, but perhaps it also takes us kind of out of this room and here to northern Uganda. This is Nelly, a South Sudanese refugee leader, and I just would like you to sharpen your eyes around what changes in a humanitarian setting, and that there are definitely also opportunities.
I'm Nelly.
sé, usted es el técnico.
A ver.
Yo hice todo lo que me dijo.
Vale. ¿Lo pones al principio?
I'm Nelly. I'm married with 3 children, and I'm a women representative. All the responsibility is on me now because I'm alone. I don't know where my husband is. My mission as a woman, I feel like to educate my children, to talk to other women, to be like me, to be exemplary as a woman. This crisis has changed a lot of things. By then in South Sudan, it was men caring for us, buying food, bringing money, buying for us clothes, everything. We sit at home, but now it has changed to the women looking for food for the children to survive, even their husbands. My life changed because in South Sudan I used to stay in a fence. What we know, I have to cook for the children, I have to cater for the children. But now, at least in a refugee settlement, I'm trained to be a leader. I could talk to women, I could counsel them. A lot of organizations comes and train women on to how to do something. That's why whenever a meeting occurs, men tend to be jealous and they say that Uganda belongs to women. They don't feel good sometimes. My responsibility is I pick information from the community and I take it to the implementing partners. And also maybe if there is a distribution, if there is an information need to be given for a women, so I'll go and attend the high authority meetings, like if I'm taken to Arua to have a women conference, and I'll gather my women and I tell them how I had been with more people, UN agencies in very long distant places. They talk more about women, and I explain to them how they talk and how a woman is supposed to be. We also talk when violence happens, a husband beating a woman. This is our meeting place. This is where we meet. We could also gather women and we talk our experience sharing so that we counsel ourselves, we advise ourselves. We, the leaders, we are working for free. We are working not for money. We are helping, but we spend a lot. Maybe my food, I have a little food, a woman runs in my house, I give a support. About my interaction with the humanitarian organizations, we are called in a meeting, general, but unfortunately they don't separate women, separate, they could talk about their issues. We don't have organization that typical talks and come and talk only to women so that we feel free to talk what men maybe do to us, and maybe it could be women, woman to woman, we interact. Like now I'm a woman, I put up my hand and I'll talk about the challenges the women have got. So they captured it and they give the feedback sometimes. We have many organizations that picks women and speak about their voice of a women in the radio stations, but only that we wanted our voice to be put in action. Like when we say that we need a women's center, to the donors who are giving a support to the implementing partners here in Bidi. I'm really appealing in the name of the women in the Bidi settlement, if they can support us by giving us income generation activities, they can train us in different things. I cannot be educated, not going to school, but I can do something by myself. But I can make a soap, I can make beads, I can make a shoes for my own. Where my voice is taken out, it's the voice of women. And I would like it to be all over the world, so that the world will know about the women in Bidi.
I'm leaving it here.
Lo voy a dejar aquí para ahorrar un poco de tiempo, pero siento que en 5 minutos tendremos todas las respuestas sobre qué hay que hacer.
Answered. Yeah. So I would like to note we started a bit late, right? I was looking at the watch. Sorry. So just to bring this home, this point was really opportunities exist. Shifts are really vivid. But it's important to understand that gender transformative changes are not automatic. They will not happen out of the blue. They need to be identified and proactively seized. The example given by Luisa around coordinating, collaborating, adequately sequencing the type of work to make them more effective, that's the way to go. One last point, it is also about mitigating backlash. The spaces for women's participation are closing. Often we see it, oh, yeah, backlash, it's an unintended consequence. We take note of it in evaluation reports. No, this needs to be firmly and squarely integrated into proposals and designs, and practical measures be implemented to address those backlashes. Going back, gender transformative change implies a shift in power relations. And Isadora said it perfectly yesterday. Shout out to you. If you are doing gender transformative work and everyone is happy, you are failing in actually doing it. So what we found in all the different stories and voices from women was that positive feelings coexist with negative and mixed feelings. Anxiety, fear at the beginning, but then it can also change over time. I want to share the other two quotes to give a reflection of this. So speaking to a Syrian refugee in Jordan who was involved in income generation projects, she was saying, if I get a chance to rest, for sure I will not say no. Let the men take responsibilities again. When probing further, why is that? Because not much has changed with regards to domestic care responsibilities. So women being completely overworked, right? So it's to see this kind of complexity ingrained. The next quote is from a Rohingya man in Bangladesh. And it's quite interesting and complex as well. On the one hand, we are not happy because women now belittle men, because the women get food from the government now instead of from their husbands. On the other hand, we are happy because when women give birth, they get help from INGOs or NGOs. They are not in pain and the children get vaccinated. So also this kind of complexity behind, but the power, I want to keep it, right? So yeah, the complexity thereof, and also acknowledging that not everything is super nice and shiny and positive. It can shift, it can change. It is an accommodation process, and we need to be prepared for this. I'm trying to make the next, the next change and trying to set this up. So we are going to jump contexts now, or go back to Bangladesh actually, to this women's group called Shanti Mohila. These are adult women, mostly married and widowed, of course, who lived through horrendous experience of, I say it, genocide. There are legal definitions, right? But when you listen to those women, you can hardly discuss that. And it was interesting to learn when they speak about their experiences back home, speaking about a very strict sexual division of labor, restrictions in movement, living as a Muslim minority in a Buddhist majority country. So they were actually saying, moving to Bangladesh, we were able to live our religion more freely. Interesting. And we are becoming more visible. We are now in public spaces because we have to. At the same time, we see the women, which from perhaps our perspective, you might question yourself about visibility. So also this invitation to question our ideas and images, right? And I'm sorry, I will need to cut it and jump because there are two parts I would like to show you. No, like I start from the beginning, right? It's also the setup is also so very important, right? Rather than just continuing.
Assalamualaikum, I go Burma, go Rohingya, go Mayapua.
Assalamualaikum, I go Rohingya, Mayapua.
Assalamualaikum, I go Burma, Rohingya, Mayapua.
Assalamualaikum, I go Rohingya, Mayapua.
Assalamualaikum, I go Burma, Rohingya, Mayapua.
Assalamualaikum, I go Burma, Rohingya, Mayapua.
Assalamualaikum, I go Rohingya, Mayapua.
Assalamualaikum, I go Rohingya, Mayapua.
Arawalamde, Shantimular group, Arawalande, Kutu Elam, came for Mataki de Ara, Arawaldi and Arar, Istiri.
About the office thing.
Ara Burmatu both do Kostoguri Arashi, Burmatun with a Bangladesh, Shai Badara Kiji, Sarga Kuda Leta Valagira, Taki Badara Kiji, Manish as soon as Zundolo, Arabian, Dolo, but as soon as Zundili, Madashanti Diara, or Shaya Manatita Shanti, Hanibadi Kiguri Ara, Shantire, Nella Farayara.
I bade Araki Yuji, Handi Hantagitam. Marathon Basana, Kasuna Rasarula, Handi Hantagitam, Arazona, Zundolo, Badi, Handitam, Handira, Zonazon Busditam, Busdivade, Kigutam, Tolehan Tamamaze, Eva Madam Foshe, Eva Madam Fosi Bade, Kiguje, Arare, go Lectopa the High, Lectoma go the Kidde, my hand peninsula the key, my hand the Garisala the key, so my Argo, my Tami Villa, he were Rastini go to the key, to live Tanghara. He were Bacha, Sansari go to the key, Bacha Hacho the key, to live at Torcada de Salafare. In the Havana to Kesha Shahasi. Shahasaiba the Araki, Ara good dealer Socto Valley, Maharavalai, Bakaravalai, Tarasum, Taharavali Arki, in a handy home long of you, to the Ara in Goriana, and where Ara Santimula Mazgoli, Arago Santimula group bandi.
Begin a suluko badi, Arama, and the suluko badaraki, Assisi, who the conditions, and Mother of Juan Bisargori. Juan Bisargoraki, which begin a Mosaraguris, a sulugori, Sasha Manja Tiblu, Tiblu with Arayanki, Jassis, and Marayan, the Hasian father.
Arati Arati Guruti, Santimuhilar Gurutun, Ginu Bayo,
Santimula Gurara, Guru to Tirijan Gurutun. I to our lovely as Mazia can the Hasutuli, Section my vendor got tibler, section my vendor tibler, as much for Sadivali. Toilaki, Johnny Vegi to our luck. Ruangala, something more like Gurutun, Johnny Vegi, Tola, Ruanga Bible and the love of Allah. Have Allah.
Tara mani shanti mohila shashad dolo yara ara dujan mili yara ara bollo kodda jayara manchara mani ara shanti mohila tora mani ara mati saati divana yalla ara bisar Allah tara rokolla ara.
I'm so awfully sorry of cutting this off, but again, in this small sequence, this expression of psychological kind of trauma and harm of going through a violent displacement like this, kind of you need to come together, right, before starting this fancy idea of participation. At the same time, this very important kind of drive for justice, coming together, collecting 400 fingerprints and sending them off to the ICC, right? I would like to just jump ahead because the women worked really, really hard to then formulate their demands, their political demands, which we often as humanitarians do not really like to hear, right? But here they go.
Assalamu alaikum. Arabilandu ko shanti mular guru. Yanolde Arab demand. Eglambaram maze Arab Burma sarkar zulum ko dinalo bole Arab bisasai. Du lambaram maze Arab Rohingya bandu tun hukumata hama maze tay barawuru.
Tin lambaram maze onno komzen tashi bishi soliburi phare inle Arab Rohingya bandu tin dile deshe maze soliburi pharawuru. Salambaram maze onno komar mai hondri biashai divasham maze Burma hukumata tiambushan olo Arab Rohingya mai hondri biashai divasham Burma hukumata tiambushan lodian nolwa furbu.
Halambar ma citizenship dia hori angara to era ayeno fuanji no ye ino citizenship ta ba in Burma hak dadda la salambar ma de Rohingya mani lwa hori
halambar ma de ara Rohingya dharma Rohingya ti gori bhara horibo hastalambar ma de deshe bideshe jaya bhara horibo nijer deshe to gori bhara horibo
Nalambar ma de Burma ma de jinisa ke zariya ara babba in deshe bisi gedin ara odat gotte sai 10 lambar ma de ara mosud ma de satala majidi kule diwala sai
11 নম্বর আমাদের অন্য কমর ফাইন্ডে জিন্দিলা এলমরে ফরি ফারে আর রোহিঙ্গার ফাইন্ডে জিন্দিলা এলমরে ফরি ফারা ফরিব 12 নম্বর আমাদের আর রোহিঙ্গারে বেনাকুসুরি মন্ডুবুসি দাঙ্গা জেল আমাদের কাঁচার দিন ইরদি ফেলা হলো
13 নম্বর আমাদের আর হতি হুরুন দিয়া ফুরিব 14 নম্বর আমাদের আর রোহিঙ্গার ফাইন্ডে তো আজাদির সাথে চলি ফারা হলো
15 নম্বর আমাদের আর তো যেত বাচ্চা লইতে না হয় তো লই ফারা হরিব এতো ইন হুকুমতের বালানত টাকা হলো
So this is what comes out when you ask women about their ideas of participation and localization, like very strong demands around justice, around citizenship, around laws, right? Yeah, I did it. Super. Just to bring this home, and I hope we can discuss a bit further, is that we found, or we actively dispel the myth that women do not want to participate. All women we encountered really have ideas, strong opinions, and also demands. However, the format of participation opportunities does not fit women's preferred ways of participating, often, I say. Or on the other hand, women participate in ways that are not expected by humanitarian agents, right? So we see that, for example, in the context of Uganda, when there are big meetings of 200 people and you have the opportunity to raise your hand and then have the opportunity to speak for 30 seconds, right? And women were telling us about the stress this creates and, oh my God, I didn't sleep because I was so nervous and then I got to talk, but I forgot 5 things and only said 2. So the issue about which format of participation. And also around, I feel also policing which type of participation. In the very concrete case of the Rohingya women in Cox's Bazar, with the strong political claims and demands, this is too thorny for humanitarians. This is, no, you're talking about something else. this can actually create violence and strife. It's not the nice participation of women that we are actually anticipating. So the claims for spaces to organize, to meet, to collect and to strategize are not provided, right? And I had here this very interesting quote from one of the women, also herself Rohingya. It is about changing social norms, not changing what women want. Women already know what they want. They are groups of angry women who survived genocide, rape and displacement. They don't need to be convinced in their own stories. They just need to know if they speak up, they will be listened to and that they will be safe. Their passion for justice is extraordinary. So super interesting, but then what are the humanitarians talking about when talking about participation, kind of effective participation, right? Sorry, one other findings was also, so the second finding here really is, it's not about a one-off empowerment training exercise. It's really for all of us to be better in addressing the structural barriers to women's participation. To create those women-safe spaces for that strategizing. And last but not least, or possibly the most important things, women need means to be able to participate. And we see it so beautifully in CARE's Women Lead program, where there's an independent budget line allowing women to do whatever they want to do and to listen to their priorities. So this can include, of course, literacy trainings, language skills, income generation. Those are the more traditional ones. But it's also flexible funds for transport, for airtime, to be able to communicate, right? Women in all contexts want a space of their own, a room of her own, right? And in Colombia, women went even a step further. In Quibdó, that particular region, after more than 10, 15 years of international cooperation, they were saying, we are tired. Like, we want to co-create. We are empowered enough. We want to co-implement projects. Wasn't that what the empowerment was all about? And still they come and bring us more and more empowerment projects, trainings, right? We want money to implement ourselves. Okay. Bear with me. So we are now jumping to Colombia. Just also a small fragment in the middle of a video. This is more around going more how affected women actually see the humanitarian response actors. And it was quite interesting. In Colombia, one woman was saying, humanitarian actors? So what's that? The chalecos, the ones with the vests, passing through very fast with their cars, staying only in the urban towns, but never reaching the communities. Okay, here they go.
Señora Damari, ¿quién es usted?
Soy Damari Palacio, una hija del Chocó, madre cabeza de familia, mujer emprendedora, mujer lideresa, mujer comunitaria, una mujer que le apuesta 100% a todos los procesos organizativos, al proceso de paz y a la inclusión social. Tuve la oportunidad de parte del colectivo de mujeres del territorio ser propuesta para participar del acuerdo humanitario ya para el departamento del Chocó, y no me sentí convocada efectivamente, no me llamaban, siempre estaba pendiente para donde hubiera que ir a participar con ese enfoque de género, y no me sentí reflejada en ningún momento porque nunca me hacían las me llegaban las convocatorias, habían barreras, nunca había dinero para la participación de la mujer. Entonces lo que decían siempre era, se colocaba la traba de que siempre era que los recursos no alcanzaban y que solo iban 2 o 3 personas y el enfoque de género no se había visibilizado. Entonces pienso que que no han sido tenido en cuenta esa participación de la mujer en apoyo de la cooperación internacional en el territorio. Vemos que el apoyo internacional más se ve reflejado en lo urbano, porque a las comunidades no llegan esos apoyos. Siempre hay un obstáculo porque no hay un fluido de llegar hasta allá a las comunidades, ¿sí? Entonces es bastante preocupante. Pensamos como mujeres de acá del Chocó y más como Damaris, quisiera hacer como una observación de que hay organizaciones de mujeres que tenemos ya más de 22 años de estar aquí en el territorio resistiendo toda esta problemática del desplazamiento y que hemos logrado organizarnos y hacer parte de muchas escuelas formativas, escuelas de incidencia política, y nos hemos capacitado para poder ayudar a otras mujeres y más que a las mujeres, también a los jóvenes que son nuestra semilla, y no hemos podido avanzar en ese propósito porque no tenemos siquiera una casa de paso o una oficina donde puedan llegar ellas con confianza. Entonces nos toca desplazarnos y a veces también se nos queda muy difícil llegar hasta donde ellas están porque no tenemos un proyecto productivo que nos genere ingresos. Nosotras hemos venido haciendo un trabajo, nosotras hemos sido operadoras de cambio, nosotras hemos sido transformadoras de vida, nosotras hemos hecho puerta a puerta, hemos ido a las comunidades, hemos ido a las zonas urbanas y sentimos cómo esas mujeres nos necesitan y esas mujeres nos piden y nos dicen cuándo van a volver, necesitamos que vengan a hacernos una réplica, un taller, una formación, pero quedamos allí porque no tenemos herramientas efectivas de trabajo porque todo se queda en las organizaciones grandes.
Mi nombre es Julia Susana Mena, soy del municipio de Medio Atrato. Mi río es Bebaramá, lo quiero mucho. Soy de la zona rural, pertenezco a Cocomacia. He tenido muchas experiencias con la cooperación internacional y una de las experiencias que he tenido ha sido el apoyo que han tenido las mujeres aquí en el departamento de Chocó, específicamente la Comisión de Género, porque me tengo que referir a lo que he vivido. Ha sido una experiencia muy bonita, pero algunas me parece, no me siento recogida con algunas cosas que se hacen, porque en su momento me he sentido utilizada. ¿Y por qué lo digo? Porque a veces vienen unas cosas muy duras, tajantes desde allá, sin siquiera mirar la necesidad que tiene la mujer. Entonces, uno que hace un trabajo rural, no es lo mismo la mujer urbana con la mujer rural, porque es que la mujer rural tiene doble guerra. Y es una persona que no le llegan las instituciones, no le llega ni por el gobierno ni por ningún lado. Y las organizaciones internacionales, la cooperación internacional, llegan por medio de un tercero cuando llegan, porque los más se quedan acá en el urbano. Me ha tocado ir comunidad por comunidad a 124 consejos comunitarios.
She continues talking, and it's amazing and super interesting and highly critical of how humanitarians actually do their work. But in the interest of time, and I would like to move on. So the way affected women perceive humanitarian actors is quite different from what humanitarians would like them or like to be seen, right? So there are issues around kind of providing punctual opportunities but not sustained kind of support. There are no opportunities for longer-term partnerships based and rooted in equality, acknowledging the work, all the work they are doing, really also very unsafe types of work. At the same time, humanitarian agencies continue to rely on women's unpaid labor to do very relevant and important things for humanitarian actors. I just would like to read you the first quote. "They have us tired, running from one meeting to the next, from event to event. But when you turn around, it is us, the women, who pick up and collect the cups, sweep the floors. They do not consider us for any project opportunities, and we feel that they are using us, and we don't want them to use us anymore." This is from Satari camp. So the way humanitarian aid or assistance is delivered is still not working, still not arriving for women. And last but not least, the localized ways of participating are not acknowledged. All the richness we have seen in those 3 videos, and we would also see in the last and 4th video, are about women's creativity, the work women's self-led groups conduct, the role, the amazing, trailblazing, gender stereotypes crushing role of young female volunteers. Also the role of connectors, those people who link the communities also to humanitarian actors. For example, the Rohingya midwives we talked about, they have privileged knowledge of household needs, but they are not included into needs assessment thus far. Similarly, the work with the imams around advocating for minimum age of 18 years for marriage. Last but not least, what we found in different contexts is that women are first responders. CARE has also a very interesting report around women first responders. But it was quite interesting to see in Colombia, in the Chocó department, how women kind of rush to support those communities that are confined by armed actors and cannot move and are actually starving, right? Putting their lives at risk. When asked what would be useful, kind of how could the humanitarian response be useful to you, she was very clear, the respondent. We need a speedboat and we need a women's shelter. Both things fall outside the realm of what is actually possible in a humanitarian response in Chocó. I've been asked to talk about the critical. So participatory video, it provided super interesting insights, and you could delve into those videos and derive important information. But you need to be able to hold that space. If you say women lead, then you need to be prepared to have women lead. And sometimes it does not go the way you want. I would have loved to document better the process behind the participatory video production, because something happens amongst women when they work together on sharing their stories, on presenting their narratives, on formulating their demands. It's an amazing methodology of joint work. A big kind of sorrow for me is that women were so interested to see and to hear and to have translated the videos of all the other women participants, which was not possible because I did not budget for it, I didn't even thought about. So the issue about sharing information, about bringing it once again back, we thought we did our job with the film screening, right? Last but not least, so what is the impact of those stories? I'm afraid I do not know. Is this being used? Is the humanitarian responses, are they being changed? I just do not know. This is perhaps one of the nice kind of reports you find there, but the idea, everything is kind of out there, and I just feel in terms of closing remarks that humanitarian actors are not gender-neutral players. They shape and they influence opportunities. And it's not only what they do, but also how they do it, right? And I think a key step here is to listen to the priorities, the solutions proposed by affected women, and to provide adequate support because they know best. And last but not least, such organizational efforts, such as Women Lead, for example, or any other kind of community-based grassroots up effort is really the key forward. Throwing your way in, generating opportunities, accompaniment in kind of training for participation. I think that is absolutely key. But now it's 1:30 and we started late. And what about my women from Syria? Is there still time to have to see the women from Syria? Yes? I'm putting you in the spot of the bad cop, right? No, just let's hear into that last video. Why? Because when you ask once again, so what's participation for you, what's gender transformative change and localization, they come up with a completely different narrative. In a protracted crisis where they are stuck 7, 8, 9 years in a camp, they don't care about these questions. They want solutions to their problems, right? So thank you for the space.
عندي ولدين بحب عايشين هيك وبخايفين مثلا
نقعد مطاولة انت بديش 10 مرات تقومي.
عندك بالبيت وبعدين بلشي
دي الورقة واثقة. لا شو روح قاعدين.
أنا لاجئة سورية داخل على الأردن من 7 سنين. ساكن مخيم الزعتري. عندي أولاد متزوجين ومعاهم عيال. بحسب 1000 حساب يوم إني بدي أروح على سوريا. بدهم يسحبوهم على الجيش وما فيش معين لأطفالهم ولا نسائهم.
أنا لاجئة سورية من مخيم الزعتري. تاريخ دخولي 5/5/2013. بتمنى يفتحوا هجرة لبلاد برا برية الأردن لهالشباب اللاجئين مشان المعيشة ومشان الجيش من خوفنا على أولادنا من لهم مصروفهم معيشتهم مستقبلهم ودراستهم. إن شاء الله الفكرة تصل لفوق فوق يا رب ويسمعونا إن شاء الله.
السلام عليكم. أنا مرأة من مخيم الزعتري. أنا زلمتي روح على سوريا بشغلات خاصة وبدي يجي يشوفنا صار له 4 سنين ونص مش قادرين نشوفه. إجا على الأردن تا يشوفوا ما خلوناش نشوفه ما سمحوناش. نطلب من الجهات العليا إنه يسمحوا فرص إنه زيارات أو لم شمل بس هالناس اللي بالأردن تشوف السوريين والسوريين يجوا من الأردن يجوا من سوريا يشوفوا أهل الأردن. يعني مثل أنا زلمتي مش تايين أولاده يشوفوا أولاده ومنعوا يفوتوا الأردن. نتمنى منكم إنه سووا لنا زيارات أقل شيء شهر شهرين نشوف بعضنا ورد يعني. والسلام عليكم.
جاهزين؟
السلام عليكم. أنا لاجئة سورية من مخيم الزعتري. دخلت الأراضي الأردنية من عام 2013 أنا وزوجي وأطفالي الأبرياء بسبب الحروب التي دارت في سوريا. ومنذ دخولي من الأراضي الأردنية لا أحصل على أي فرصة عمل حتى الآن، وهذا الموضوع أثر على بيتي وأسرتي وأطفالي الأبرياء، مما سبب لي التوتر والضغط النفسي. رغم تقديمي بطلبات لجميع المنظمات بفرص عمل بسبب ابني الذي يحتاج نظارة أو يحتاج لعمل جراحي، ولكن أجلناه كونه طفل صغير. أجلوه قالوا بده نظارة. الطبيب حدد له نسبة عالية بنقص النظر وحدد له نظارة. بعدم حصولي على فرص عمل لا أستطيع شراء نظارة لابني أو أي حاجة من احتياجاتهم كونهم أطفال. نتمنى من المسؤولين عن هذا الموضوع يسمعوا أصواتنا كنساء ويوسعوا مشاريع العمل للمرأة. بتمنى نسمع صوتنا. أنا يعني لوضعي الشخصي لا يدخل أبداً على بيتي أي دخل، لا أنا ولا زوجي، ولا يوجد لهم معيل سواء أنا وزوجي، وما فيش عمل، ما فيش فرص عمل أبداً. منذ 6 سنوات أعاني من هذا الوضع.
السلام عليكم، أنا لاجئة سورية من مخيم الزعتري. جيت 2013 على الأردن، صار لي 7 سنين. أنا أولادي، أنا أرملة، مالي زلمة، جوزي متوفي، وأولادي صغار وكبروا هون وعانينا. وإحنا هون نساء بالمخيم مضغوطات بالبيت، ما فيش مكان يعني تطلع له المرأة مثلا تستريح، مثلا نفسيتها بتكون تعبانة أو كذا، يعني ما فيش مكان، مساحة. نتمنى أنه يكون للمرأة مساحة تجتمع النساء فيها، يعني يحكي مشاكلها لبعضهن، عندها كذا معلومة الثانية تعطيها الثانية، عندها مثلا شغلة تعلمها لأختها الثانية، يعني يصير نفسيتها ترتاح. ونتمنى أنه يصير لها مكان وتقدر تروح عليه كل وقت، يعني كل أسبوع مثلا يصير عندنا جلسة إحنا وهالنسوان مثلا، ونحكي مشاكلنا لبعضنا، تفرج عن نفسها الوحدة وترتاح نفسيتها.
السلام عليكم، أنا لاجئة من مخيم الزعتري، صار لي 7 سنين لاجئة هون من 2013. عايش أنا وأولادي بالمخيم والحمد لله عايشين مرتاحين. بس عم بطالب مشكلة عندنا بالمخيم، التحرش الموجود بالمخيم بكافة أنواعه، مع أنه كنا بسوريا إحنا بأمان، والشغلة هاي تقريبا بتقدر تقولي 1% موجودة كانت بسوريا عندنا. هون تقريبا صارت 99%، إذا يعني ما بدي أبالغ، يعني صراحة إنه في كثير موجود الشيء هذا. عم بطالب فيه إنه لعله المسؤولين ياخذوا حد بالسلافة هاي، توعية للشباب مشان السلافة هاي، توعية للأهل مشان شلون يوعوا أهاليهم. برضو المناطق اللي يكون فيها مجال أزمة كثير، يكون فيها فيها نظام اللي يضبط التحرش أو أي شيء. وإن شاء الله صوتي يصل للجميع وتنحل المشكلة، مش مشان بناتنا بالمخيم، لأنه صار يخافن يطلعن عبرة أو يروحن على المدرسة، أو الأهل برضو يخافوا على بناتهم من السلافة هاي، بس مو أكثر. وإن شاء الله صوتنا يصل، إحنا كلياتنا الجميع، إحنا نساء، ونتمنى كل أولادنا الخير والسعادة، وإن شاء الله منه له يا رب.
Thank you. Bueno, Luisa, muchísimas gracias por abrirnos.
Thanks a lot, Luisa, for opening up this window to the work done by you and your team and to the experiences of these women around the world. We will now give the floor to those people who are here face-to-face or online. So if you have any questions, this is the time for you.
I'm so sorry for asking so much today, but I get the chance of the silence. Thank you very much. It was very rewarding, very interesting. I would like to know if you interview girls, because for me one of the key questions when you start trying to find out what is the situation, in this case of women or any other group, is when you look at the dimension of human beings when they are very, very young. And my experience is that they perceive the world so differently. Did you interview girls? Did you explore this a little bit at all or not? And congratulations, it's really, really good. I think we should make use of this much more. Of the methodology, be much more visual, much more open, much more questioning, much more challenging to our sector. We are not doing our job properly. And I think also putting the question of the dignity as the center. I think this is one of the key questions. The humanitarian sector has to be about providing dignity and rights to people. not about providing services to people. And this is what we are missing. And this, we need to make an agreement with donors, with international NGOs, with NGOs, with independent humanitarian workers. Otherwise, we will never get it, because for me, the grand bargain is so ridiculous, even the name they gave to this serious agreement. I mean, it really reflects how superficial it was taken. I mean, such a big agreement of transforming the humanitarian sector, and you call it like that, like a joke. If we really want to transform it, we need flexibility in order to get to the point, which is about enhancing dignity of people. That's, for me, the key point. So thank you, because I think your work is in this direction. And this is my comment, and my question is about the girls.
Super interesting. We did not film with younger girls. Why? Because I think you need a different, more ludic, more playful methodology, and also the issues around informed consent and a safe space to do that. However, within the publication, the report, there are 2 or 3 videos I would like to point you to of young women. And even one young man discussing, also sharing sharing kind of experiences and expertise. And I think it really adds a very different kind of nuance to it. And I did not properly speak about kind of the role young volunteers do. So a very different video in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar of young women volunteers going house to house and doing peer psychosocial support, and what it also meant in terms of empowering kind of themselves. So please go to the publication. There are 2 or 3 kind of video clips and for young people. And I agree with you on the whole grand bargain, big things, like this absolute disconnect, right, of definitions of aspiration, but then when you ask, it doesn't connect, right? And something is missing. There's a link missing, or a step missing.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Bueno, si nadie se lanza a preguntar, yo... If no one is asking, I'd like to ask you, you've mentioned that after data collection, you have opened up a process to share it with the groups, families, etc. I'd like to ask you about that. Did you take down notes about their comments, or how do you do that? Have you seen the video? In the message, in the way you share it. The idea, and it was one of the big challenges. This is what I said before. I'm speaking in Spanish. Okay, you can move on.
The challenge. No, ya se me olvida el punto. No, the challenge here was actually to allow and be able to hold the space to let women lead and let them do whatever they want to do. Like in my head, but those are the questions, and the videos should not be more than 10 minutes because we cannot show them, right? But then it's 22 minutes in Colombia because these are the videos, this is the narrative we want to have included. No, halas, I say, it needs to be the way you want that to be. So the idea was really, and it was from every context to context different. We started off in Colombia and had a truly participatory editing process. This meant, this means that we had like the whole group sitting together was super hot in a small room looking at the video, and everyone wanted to be involved in selecting how the video is called, which pictures are actually included, what statements are good. So it was also this kind of very participatory process and project. So, and it's their video, kind of they decide with some kind of guidance of what could work and what could not, but like we did not have much influence. However, in other cases, for example, in Bangladesh, where there was like one group did not want to participate, so we started to do all the job, and we had to also agree that women walk away. because of dignity, perhaps also, like it's very important, the issue of informed consent. So we had less time, and then there it was more of a collaborative participation. It was like, I cannot afford to come tomorrow, just why don't you propose it along those lines? And our videographer then produced the video, right, and showed it to them, and it was more of a kind of proposal and then amendment, but always together with the women, I feel, yeah. The video clips is different. The video clips are kind of videos that are cut, right? Yeah.
¿Cuál dirías que fue? Which would you say, of all contexts, what is the biggest challenge for you as a team and also for the context you were in?
Possibly the most challenging context would have been in Bangladesh, possibly, because of the circumstances, because also of women being afraid in the sense of not showing their faces, right? Afraid of what others might think, the very strong normative power of gossip. So if my face is recognized, I will be gossiped about. This reduces my chances of marriage among especially the young women. In the other video of the young women, they do not clap because clapping and the noise might be seen as kind of, oh my God, what's happening in there? So they were like waving like this at the end to kind of clap, which are all small indications of how the gender norms then actually kind of work. And perhaps also to be transparent, so this one group we worked and kind of developed and validated the research questions, and then they actually arrived for the filming, but then they go like, no, our faces, like even in full face veil, they did not want. Their husbands had not authorized, they did not feel confident. There's nothing you can do, and it's very important. It's also a mechanism and a speaking out and having a voice of saying no, right? Mm.
Again. I have like a small comment. I don't want to look like bad, with all respect to the video.
Please.
In the final video, it was like so emotional, but in the humanitarian work, we should do like management for expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're visiting this camp, I think they're living the worst circumstances and they have a lot of problems. And as a humanitarian agency, when you go and visit this camp, and they will do like a shopping list, let's say it's a shopping list with their needs. So management of their expectations should be the first priority for them. Like, I need the glasses for my son. Like, maybe we are agriculture organization. We should like explain this to them. Like, I need to see my husband. I didn't see him for years. So this is my point. Thank you.
But I don't know. But was it a question or a comment? Yeah, like the issue about raising expectation was like very firmly embedded also in the methodology. Could you do it better? Probably, but the issue was kind of, we are in this kind of oasis, UN Women's Center, and it was like it had 2 or 3 days before that filming actually then took place. But I hear what you're saying, right? But I find it interesting. You come and you want to speak about participation and localization, and you end up speaking about health problems and the glasses of the sun, right? Because that's the more pressing thing. Mm.
Luisa quería. Hola, ahora sí. Quería.
Luisa, can you tell us a bit about your vision? Sorry, I cannot hear the question. Mic is not working. No funciona el micrófono. Can you tell us a bit, from your perspective, the use, elevating it to the agencies that have commissioned the research, elevating it to these women? What do they do with the video? From my viewpoint, very personal point of view, it's very difficult to present this as an incident mechanism because they look like anecdotes. It's something highly emotional, we understand it, but for this to influence or to have an impact on my humanitarian response is not very representative. It's more an anecdote. I want to understand from you, what do you think you will be doing of this?
Como súper interesante.
Well, I think it's very interesting from my point of view to have so much flexibility when you want to design a methodology, such an open question of saying, where's the link that we are missing, the connection between women, affected women, and the humanitarian actors. To me, that was a novelty, something very new, because we are rather extractive usually. So to me, this was very positive. On the other hand, the idea was to bring this into a social space. The work streams bosses participated there. We had some replies from both organizations, an online session, and we had 3 women participating out of the 400 in this exchange. If you have we found the link? No, it was like a closure. It was a devolution. What I would like, and this is something there to be used in public, we have to be critical, have insights, thinking how there are things that could be done in other ways. And this deals with all the existing problems. I think this is a tool to discuss, to open up new issues, new topics. This is something we are having. Capaz is a tool to discuss and identify problems and ways forward. I hear you, you come from your own area, and you say, what is this? But I believe at some point we can find the way to connect, because we need to move on from counting workshops to see the change, and the change from the viewpoint of women. Is this the way? I don't know, but there must be some outcome harvesting, some participatory exercises, not just counting numbers, not only workshops, something mixed, yeah. And otherwise, as a guideline of how you can be, I was having a look at the videos, and every time I find something new. It's a very rich material, but maybe Capaz is not the tool to have impact on the big decision makers. Another thing was to touch their hearts. There's something that needs to touch their hearts, and the first idea was to have a reality, an immersive virtual reality, but that's really expensive, so we just ruled it out. Thanks for your question. Looks like we have a question over there.
Gracias por la intervención.
Thanks. I think it's very interesting, and I'd like to say that we now at the agency, we are in a process of assessing some experiences we've had in that sense by creating participatory videos by young people, and to express what they want to have on the agenda, some topics that are interesting to them. So I think this can be an important contribution to be empowered in the process, because they say they have the capacity to express themselves, and so that they can articulate a proposal, and this is a way to reach out. So I think it's interesting to have this link, or how we link this work of humanitarian action and the reality of people who are expressing themselves from their realities and needs with the work of education and communication, always respecting the safety of people. They have to know what the material will be used for, but maybe we can have some future line in there. Well, my big dream is to have this comparative work, that women in Bangladesh could see those women in Chocó, or an Afro-Colombian woman who had an earring from Africa. And I dream that a woman in Uganda can see that video. So the idea of participatory videos generates very many links that you cannot have through an interview or through focus groups. Yeah, you could write maybe 5 different reports based on this information. Can you tell us a little bit more about those links? Those links. Ask me something more specific. At the end of the day, something more personal. You are more than an interviewer. It's like a fourth wall. Tell us a little bit more about those links, and then we will go to a question we have there waiting. Well, it's about sharing in this space. I was in Colombia. It was very interesting because the moment in one of the workshops, women were sitting and the videographer, she had the whole technical equipment, everything very expensive, and she put the equipment, the technical equipment at the center, and she let them explore. They could touch the camera, the wires, the microphone. And that knowledge, we saw what it means to handle a camera, video camera. And sometimes you think this has to do with self-confidence. Who can do this? So there's some links there related to AIDS, to knowledge. And it was also interesting because the first exercise at the time was saying, who am I? And there was an exercise, and then one of us said, oh, well, yes, we are part of this group. And so at some point, those barriers are blurred and they get into your own space. But at the time, it's an exercise that generated incredible links, and it worked out very well. Everyone was telling very personal stories there from childhood, from sorrows, emotions. It was very interesting, and in those 2 minutes, we generated very strong links. Is this maybe I have the hat of the humanitarian aid? You can walk across borders, and you can have that vulnerability and share and saying we are all here on this side, and it generated something in that group dynamics. There was a woman who said, we thought everything was very beautiful, but we see you have problems, different to our problems, but not more serious or less serious. We all have problems. So it really could connect different people in that workshop in particular. We have a question there.
Nada, ahora, vale. Bueno, antes de nada.
Congrats on this work. I've had the chance to participate in processes like this, and I think they are extremely powerful methodologies that turn many of our ways of doing down. We have some biases, and the fact that we speak in the first person, that we as women, a woman can tell instead of being told, breaks very many prototypes. And it's a tool for communication, which has been maybe minimized. It's a lever for empowerment, for leadership. I have an insight also, and it's, I think, only one woman speaks on her own. Most of them speak in a group. So we see women encouraging each other, and I think that power of sorority is very important, of sisterhood. And in the case of Chocó, there's things we would need to look at, and this has been repeated. Those women who have been in very many different workshops, capacity building initiatives, they want to be protagonists. They want to implement projects, and they want to change their own realities, and also co-create spaces and co-produce. And the video where there was a woman speaking, it was like a video clip. It was a sort of interview, but there's another 9 different video clips. Yeah, but that power of the collective group, yeah, it's very important. Are there any other questions online? Well, Luisa, any final remarks you would like to add for cooperation, for Basque cooperation? No, go on with your solidarity work and support those processes from the grassroots upwards, because we need to make that connection and explore with these participatory methods. I think you have to have these spaces, and then you can have very many innovative new things. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Pues ya para cerrar.
In order to finish, I think we have until 3:30. We are going to have lunch. I'd like to thank Luisa for her participation, and we will close this panel with one of the quotes that said, "Women do know what they want. They do not need to be convinced of their own stories. They need to know when they talk, they will be listened to, and they will have in a safe environment." Thank you all for participating today.